The coffee had gone lukewarm 20 minutes ago. Ethan Cole noticed it the way he noticed most things now, without reacting, simply cataloging it as another small fact about the world. The ceramic mug sat on the edge of his desk, a faint ring of condensation seeping into the wood grain he had once cared about protecting. Outside the office window, the Chicago skyline was doing what it always did in late October, turning gray and indifferent, the lake somewhere beyond the buildings churning under a sky that had not decided whether it wanted to rain or simply threaten. The radiator in the corner of the room ticked and knocked, an old building trying to warm itself from the inside out, the sound like someone tapping a single finger against a table, over and over. Patient and without urgency, he picked up the mug. He drank the cold coffee anyway. On the desk in front of him was a single manila folder, not thick, not dramatic in any way, a folder that looked like it could contain a lease renewal or a vendor invoice or any of the 100 pieces of paperwork that moved through his office on a given Tuesday. He had set it there himself, placed it squarely in the center of the desk, squared the edges with the desk's corner. Then he had walked to the window and stood there for 11 minutes. He knew it was 11 because the clock on the wall had moved from 9:04 to 9:15, while his reflection stared back at him from the glass, a thin man in a well-fitted shirt who looked older than 36 by about a decade. The folder contained a private investigator's report, 12 pages, and 43 photographs printed on standard office paper, a slightly glossy from the laser printer. He had already read the report 3 times. He had not looked at the photographs a second time. Once had been enough to understand everything he needed to understand. He sat back down at the desk. The radiator ticked. He opened the folder to page 1 and read the name at the top of the report the way he had been reading everything lately. Cold, clinical, like reading a property assessment on a building he was considering demolishing. Diana Cole, née Hargrove, his wife of 6 years, the woman who had stood in the small courtyard of her parents' home in Naperville in a borrowed dress because they could not afford a real wedding venue, who had cried in a way that had no performance in it, who had eaten gas station sandwiches with him in the front seat of a 2009 Honda Civic on the drive back from their honeymoon, because the honeymoon itself had been a long weekend at a state park in Wisconsin, and the budget had run out by Sunday afternoon. The woman who had told him, in that car with mustard on her lip, that she was not afraid of building something from nothing because she had watched him work, and she knew he was the kind of man who finished things. He had thought about that sentence for years afterward. He had almost had it framed. He turned to page 4 of the report. Marcus Velda's name appeared in the 3rd paragraph. Of course it did. Of course it was Marcus. Ethan had started Cole Veld Capital Management 8 years ago in the 2nd bedroom of their apartment on Wacker, a real estate acquisition and asset management firm that had taken 4 years to become profitable and another 2 to become the kind of business that made people in certain rooms take his calls without hesitation. The name on the door had been his idea, a partnership gesture, a symbol of what they were building together. Marcus Veld had come in as a 30% stakeholder, a silent operator who handled client relationships and investor dinners while Ethan built the actual infrastructure, sourced the deals, ran the numbers, managed the portfolio. It had worked because they had different skill sets and because, for a long time, Ethan had trusted Marcus the way he trusted very few people. He had known Marcus since graduate school. He had been the best man at Marcus's first wedding. He turned to page 7. Jusker the investigator, a former financial crimes detective named Carl Reyes, who charged $800 a day and delivered clean, unembellished work, had documented 11 separate meetings between Diana Cole and Marcus Veld over the course of 4 months. hotel lobbies, a restaurant in the West Loop that Ethan had taken Diana to for their 5th anniversary, the parking structure adjacent to Marcus's River North condo. Reyes had not been poetic about it. He had simply listed dates, times, locations, and attached the photographs as an appendix. 11 meetings. Ethan did not feel the thing people described when they talked about moments like this: the chest collapsing, the world tilting, the dramatic rupture. He felt instead a very quiet, very specific sensation. Like the sound a room makes when a piece of furniture is moved and you can suddenly see the floor that was underneath it, the dust and the discoloration, the evidence of a long and undisturbed stillness. He had suspected something for 2 months before he hired Reyes. Not because he had caught Diana in anything obvious. She was careful, always had been, methodical in the way organized people are methodical. But because he had noticed the texture of their daily life changing in ways he could not name, but could feel. The way she answered the phone by leaving the room. The way she had stopped asking about the deals he was working when she had once been genuinely curious, as had once sat at the kitchen island with a glass of wine and asked real questions about yield curves and cap rates and the difference between a first lien and a second lien position. The way she had started saying we, less, and I, more, in sentences about the future. He had noticed. He had not said anything. He had started watching instead. There was a second component to the report. Reyes had included it at the back, a supplementary section that Ethan had not requested, but that Reyes had clearly included as a professional courtesy, something he had apparently discovered while documenting the affair and decided Ethan needed to know. Marcus Velde had been meeting with 2 of Kohlveld Capital's largest institutional investors. Separately, without Ethan's knowledge. The meetings had taken place over the past 3 months. Twice in New York, once in Dallas. Reyes had not been able to obtain the content of those meetings, but he had documented the participants and the timeline and had noted, in the dry, factual language that made his reports valuable, that he found the pattern notable and potentially material to the client's business interests. Ethan read that sentence again. Potentially material to the client's business interests. He set the folder down, picked up his pen. Put it down without writing anything. He had built Kohlveld Capital from a second bedroom and a spreadsheet and a pitch deck he had revised 47 times. He had worked years in which he consistently put in between 70 and 90 hours a week. But not out of ambition in the cinematic sense, but out of something more specific and harder to name. A relationship with work that was almost architectural, the need to build structures that held weight, that could be tested and would not fail. He had sourced their first major deal, a distressed industrial property in Pilsen, by spending 3 weekends in a row driving the neighborhood, walking the lots, talking to business owners, building a case that no one else had bothered to make because the area did not look like a bet worth taking. It had returned 22%. That deal had opened the next door, and that door had opened the next. And now Kohlveld Capital managed a portfolio valued at slightly over $200 million across 31 properties, and a secondary fund that held commercial paper and bridge loans. This Marcus Veld had attended every investor dinner for 8 years. He was charming and well-dressed, and he knew which wine to order and how to tell a story about their portfolio in a way that made people feel like they were being let into something exclusive. He was valuable for those things. Ethan had always known, in the quiet way he knew most things, that Marcus's value was exterior, the packaging around a product that Ethan himself had built and continued to build every day. And now Marcus was meeting with their institutional investors. Alone. Ethan pressed his fingertips together and thought. The question was not what was happening. That was clear. Marcus was positioning himself to acquire Ethan's equity stake. Whether through a forced buyout, a dilution play engineered at the board level, or some agreement already being negotiated with the institutional investors to back a restructure that cut Ethan out, the direction was legible. A man does not have private meetings with two of your largest clients in different cities over 3 months without the presence of your shared business attorney for reasons that are benign. The question was how far along it was, and whether Diana was a participant in it or simply a coincidence. Ethan did not believe in coincidences at this level. He picked up his phone and scrolled to a contact he had not called in over a year. Ray Fontaine, corporate attorney, one of the most technically precise legal minds in the state, a man who spoke in long compound sentences that were exhausting at dinner and invaluable in a deposition. They had worked together on 3 deals, and Ethan had always appreciated that Ray did not offer comfort or reassurance, only information and strategy. He held the phone for a moment without dialing. Then he set it down. Not yet. Before he made a single phone call, before he spoke to Ray or anyone else, he needed to understand the exact state of his legal exposure, his shareholding structure, the operating agreement, the provisions that governed forced buyouts, dilution events, and the circumstances under which a partner could be removed. He needed to know precisely where his leverage was and precisely where his vulnerabilities were before he showed anyone his hand. Because once you made the first move visible, you could not unmake it. He pulled a separate file from his desk drawer, the operating agreement for Cole Veld Capital, dated 8 years ago, was with 3 subsequent amendments. He had drafted the original with a startup attorney who had charged them a flat rate because they could not afford anything more, and the document showed its origins. There were provisions that were solid, and provisions that were dangerously ambiguous, places where the language was imprecise in ways that had not mattered when trust was intact, but mattered enormously when trust was gone. He began reading, not skimming, reading every line. The 3rd amendment, added 4 years ago, contained a provision he had not thought about in years. A buyout mechanism triggered by either partner with a 90-day notice window, valuing the outgoing partner's stake at a formula tied to trailing 12-month revenue. At the time of signing, that provision had seemed like a reasonable exit mechanism, and a clean way to separate if the partnership stopped working. He had signed it without concern because he had not, at that time, imagined needing to think about it adversarially. He read the formula. Then he read it again. The formula used gross revenue, not net. It did not account for the firm's asset appreciation. In practical terms, it valued his 70% equity stake based on fee income and fund management fees, not on the underlying asset value of the portfolio. At the current revenue run rate, a forced buyout would value his stake at somewhere between $14 and $17 million. The portfolio itself, under any reasonable market valuation, was worth north of $140 million. He sat with that for a long moment. The radiator ticked. He understood, yet in a way that felt almost structural, the same way he understood a building's load-bearing capacity or a loan's debt service coverage, what was being attempted. If Marcus triggered the buyout provision and had institutional investor backing to fund the acquisition, He could pay Ethan out at the contractual formula price, $17 million at the high end, and acquire the controlling interest in a $200 million portfolio. Then, presumably, a restructured partnership with a new stakeholder, a divorce settlement that used the formula valuation, not the market valuation, to calculate the marital asset. Diana taking her share of the buyout proceeds, not of the actual business. It was, Ethan thought, a well-constructed play. Not brilliant, but well-constructed. The problem with well-constructed plays, in his experience, which was that they depended entirely on the target not seeing them in time. He stood up and walked to the window again. The lake was visible now, a flat, gray line at the edge of the city, the color of old aluminum. He had driven past it 10,000 times without stopping to look at it properly. He looked at it now. He had 11 photographs and 12 pages of documentation and an operating agreement with an exploitable provision and a wife who had been meeting with his business partner in hotel lobbies for 4 months. He had something else, too. He had time. Not much. If Marcus was already in conversations with the institutional investors, the clock was moving. But enough. A man moving cautiously moved slower than a man who thought his target was unaware. Marcus believed Ethan did not know. That belief was the most valuable asset Ethan possessed at this moment, and he intended to spend it with the precision of a man who understood that you only got to use it once. He went back to his desk, opened his laptop, pulled up the ownership structure chart for the firm, the subsidiary entities, the real estate holding companies, the secondary fund vehicle. Then he opened a second tab and began searching for a very specific type of attorney. Not a corporate litigator, not a divorce attorney, but an estate and trust attorney with experience in the type of asset restructuring that was, in the right hands, legal, defensible, and effectively invisible until it was too late to contest. It took him 40 minutes to identify 3 names. He spent another 20 minutes reading their firm profiles, their published work, just their professional reputations. He eliminated the first 2 on different grounds. The third, a woman named Irene Sato, who had spent 12 years as a corporate attorney before transitioning to estate planning and asset protection, had published an article in a legal journal 2 years prior on the topic of legitimate pre-litigation asset structuring that had demonstrated a quality of thinking he respected. He called her office at 10:47 in the morning. Her assistant put him on hold for 4 minutes. When Irene Sato came on the line, her voice was even and unhurried, the voice of someone who had heard everything and was still paying attention. "Mr. Cole, how can I help you?" It was not phrased as a question. He noticed that. He liked it. "I need an appointment," he said. "This week, if possible. But the matter involves asset restructuring, and I would prefer not to discuss details over the phone." A brief pause. "I have Thursday at 2. "I'll be there," he said. He hung up. Picked up the cold coffee mug, found it empty, and walked to the small kitchen down the hall to make a fresh pot. While the coffee brewed, he stood at the counter and ran the numbers in his head. The way he had always done, without paper, just the architecture of figures arranging themselves in mental space, the clean geometry of financial reality. Diana would not initiate the divorce. She would wait. She was strategic in her own right, always had been, and she would let Marcus's business play develop to the point where the formula buyout was triggered and Ethan's equity was formally valued at the contracted price. Then the divorce filing would arrive, Jinson with that valuation as the basis for the asset division calculation. His stake, freshly valued at $17 million by the buyout mechanism, would be the number her attorney would use. Half of $17 million was $8.5 million. In a state where marital assets were divided equitably, She might walk away with something in that range, possibly more depending on the judge and her attorney's argument. It was a reasonable number, if your goal was to take a reasonable number. The problem, her problem, though she did not know it yet, was that Ethan Cole had spent 8 years building a portfolio of 31 properties, and he understood those assets the way a carpenter understands wood. He knew where the grain was, he knew exactly where each board had come from, who had appraised it, was what it was worth, and what it could be made to be worth, and which boards could be moved without changing the structure of the house. And he knew something else that Marcus Velde apparently did not know, despite 8 years of being his business partner. Ethan Cole had never put all of his holdings into Cole Veld Capital. There had always been a secondary layer. Not hidden. Nothing he was about to do would be hidden, because the instant you hid something, you created criminal exposure, and Ethan had zero interest in criminal exposure. But separate. 8 properties held in individual LLCs that predated the founding of Cole Veld Capital, entities he had never contributed to the partnership because the operating agreement only obligated him to contribute future acquisitions, not existing holdings. Just those 8 properties had been acquired in his late 20s, before Marcus, before the firm, when he had been doing single deals on his own with hard money loans and construction crews he managed himself. They were not glamorous assets. A 6-flat in Bridgeport, a small retail strip in Berwyn, a warehouse in Cicero, 5 others of similar profile. At the time of Cole Veld Capital's founding, they had been worth a combined $4 million. 8 years of appreciation and modest improvements later, he had never had them formally reappraised. The properties sat on his personal balance sheet at their original carrying values, which were low and outdated and did not reflect current market conditions. He poured the coffee. It was hot this time. He carried it back to his desk and sat down in front of his laptop. But he did not touch the keyboard for a full minute. Then he opened a real estate market analysis database he subscribed to and began pulling current comparable sales data for each of the 8 neighborhoods where his personal properties sat. He worked methodically, pulling 3 comparables for each property, building a rough informal valuation that he did not save to any shared drive, did not print, did not send to anyone. He kept it in his head. When he was done, he sat back. The 8 properties, at current market rates, were worth between $22 and $26 million. Not spectacular, not the portfolio-level assets Cole Veld Capital held, but real, solid, and entirely outside the firm's legal structure. They were also, depending on how the marital asset discovery process unfolded, was potentially visible in a divorce proceeding. Illinois was an equitable distribution state, not a community property state, which gave judges more discretion, but marital assets were broadly defined, and a good forensic accountant working for Diana's attorney would eventually find the personal LLCs, which meant they needed to move before a divorce was filed. Not disappear. Move. There was a critical distinction that Irene Sato would understand. He spent the rest of Tuesday and all of Wednesday reviewing the LLC structures, the titling on each property, the mortgage status of each asset, and the current state of his personal estate documents. He found 3 significant structural opportunities he intended to discuss with Irene Sato. He also found, during his review of the secondary fund vehicle's operating documents, and a clause that made him stop and reread twice, a provision that gave the fund's general partner discretion to admit new limited partners without the consent of existing partners under specific circumstances related to liquidity needs. He filed that away in the part of his mind where he kept things that might matter later. Thursday at 2 o'clock, he walked into Irene Sato's office, on the 41st floor of a building in the Loop. The office was clean and not ostentatious, the furniture functional and well-made, the kind of office that signaled a person interested in work rather than impression. Sato herself was 50-something, Korean-American, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a yellow legal pad already open on her desk. She did not offer coffee. She waited for him to sit, and then waited for him to speak. And he appreciated both of those choices. He laid it out for her in 20 minutes without editorializing: the firm structure, the operating agreement's buyout provision, the formula valuation gap, his personal properties, his reasonable belief based on specific documented evidence that a business partner was engaged in conduct that would trigger or manufacture a forced buyout within the coming weeks or months, and his concurrent reasonable belief that a divorce filing would follow in coordination with that business action. Sato listened without interrupting. When he finished, she clicked her pen once. "You're not here to fight it," she said. "No. You're here to restructure before the fight starts." "Yes." She wrote something on the legal pad. "How much time do you think you have?" 6 weeks at the outside. Possibly as few as 3. "Tight." She wrote something else. "Doable, if we move in the right sequence." She looked at him over the top of her glasses, which she had pulled down from her forehead. "I want to be very clear about the framework we operate in. Every move we make is legal, documented, and defensible in court. Nothing we do will constitute a fraudulent transfer or a fraudulent conveyance under Illinois statute. The goal is not to defraud. The goal is to structure your personal assets in a way that reflects genuinely appropriate estate planning that you should have done years ago and didn't." She paused. "Is that understood?" "Completely." "Then here is what I'm thinking." She spent 35 minutes walking him through a structure. It was not complicated in concept, though it was precise in execution. And the personal property, LLCs, would be transferred into an irrevocable trust, structured as a domestic asset protection trust using a Delaware trustee, which Illinois recognized under specific conditions. The transfer would be made at current appraised fair market value. She would bring in an independent appraiser whose work was above reproach. And the trust would be structured with legitimate estate planning purposes: generational wealth transfer, liability protection, professional management continuity. The transfer itself would be public record, discoverable, fully documented. There would be nothing to hide, because nothing would be hidden. The legal effect, once the transfer was complete and the statutory waiting period for fraudulent conveyance challenges had run, and was that those assets would no longer be Ethan's personal assets in the way that made them divisible in a divorce proceeding. They would be trust assets, managed by a trustee, with Ethan as the designated beneficiary during his lifetime. A divorce court could not simply divide them. It could acknowledge their existence as a benefit to Ethan, but dividing the trust assets themselves would require a separate legal challenge that Diana's attorneys would need to mount against the trust structure, which, if the structure was clean and the timing predated the divorce filing by a sufficient margin, would fail. The timing was the critical variable. Illinois courts scrutinized pre-divorce asset transfers closely. The rule of thumb in the legal community was that transfers made within 2 years of a divorce filing were subject to heightened scrutiny. Transfers made before a divorce was reasonably anticipated were on much firmer ground. "You said you have no formal knowledge of an impending divorce," Sato said. "I have no formal knowledge," Ethan confirmed. I have private investigator documentation of my wife's meetings with my business partner, which I obtained because I had concerns about my business partner's conduct. The investigator's report is in my possession. I have told no one about it and taken no action. Sato nodded slowly. If you have not been served with divorce papers, if you have not received a demand letter, if no attorney has contacted you on your wife's behalf, then the divorce is not, in legal terms, reasonably anticipated. Yet you are restructuring your estate in response to a perceived business threat, which is an entirely legitimate reason. She looked at him. The order of operations matters enormously here. The trust documentation must reflect estate planning rationale, not divorce protection rationale. The paperwork must be drafted and executed correctly. A pause. I've done this before for clients facing similar circumstances. I know exactly how it needs to look. How quickly can you begin? I'll have my paralegal reach out to the independent appraiser today. We can have the appraisal completed in 10 to 12 business days. Trust documents, another 2 weeks. She did the math on her legal pad. You're looking at 30 to 35 days to completion, assuming no complications. 30 to 35 days. Against his estimate of 3 to 6 weeks before Marcus moved. I'll need you to prioritize it, he said. I understand. My rate for expedited work is $1,500 an hour. The full structure will likely cost between $40,000 and $60,000 in legal fees. Fine. She closed the legal pad. One more thing. The Colveld Capital Equity, the buyout provision. That's separate from what I do. You'll want a corporate litigator looking at the operating agreement for defensive strategies, someone who can challenge the formula valuation in court if Marcus triggers the buyout. I have someone in mind. Use them. She stood. Mr. Cole. He looked at her. You came in here calm, she said. That's either because you're in shock or because you're built differently. She studied him for a moment. Don't let either of those things make you sloppy. He walked out of her office into the gray Chicago afternoon, the wind off the lake cold enough to cut through his jacket, and he thought that it had been a long time since anyone had assessed him that cleanly. He called Ray Fontaine from the sidewalk. Ray picked up on the second ring, which meant he was in his office and not in a meeting, which meant Ethan could ask for the thing he needed without the preliminary choreography of scheduling. Ray, I need a read on a forced buyout scenario in a closely held LLC operating agreement. Existing provision, formula valuation, potential challenge on the grounds of below-market valuation. Ray was quiet for 2 seconds. Send me the document. Not yet. I need to know first whether the valuation formula is challengeable on its face without triggering the notification clause in the operating agreement. Another pause. Ray understood immediately. You need to evaluate your position before your co-partner knows you're evaluating your position. Yes. Bring the document to my office. I'll review it in person. No emails, no copies that leave my possession. Tomorrow morning. 8:30, Ray said, and hung up. Ethan walked to his car. The city moved around him in the usual way. Taxis, pedestrians, delivery trucks, the specific urban noise of Chicago in October, the smell of exhaust, and something faintly like rain that hadn't arrived yet. He sat in the driver's seat without starting the car for a moment, both hands on the wheel. He thought about Diana, not about the photographs, or not about Marcus or the hotel lobbies or the restaurant where they had celebrated their anniversary. He thought about her the way he thought about the most complex deals he had ever worked, the ones where the variables were numerous and the emotional components needed to be bracketed and set aside, not because they didn't matter, but because they would compromise the quality of his analysis if he let them run. Diana was not stupid. She was, in many ways, very intelligent. Specifically intelligent in the social and interpersonal dimensions where Ethan himself was less naturally skilled. She would be watching him. She would be reading his behavior the way she always had, alert to shifts in temperature, to changes in the texture of their daily life. If he behaved differently, if he was suddenly cold, or suddenly warm, or suddenly absent, and she would notice, and she would tell Marcus, and Marcus would accelerate his timeline, which meant Ethan needed to be exactly himself for the next 35 days. He started the car. He drove home to the house in Lincoln Park, the house that had been a renovation project for the first 2 years after they bought it, scaffolding and subcontractors, and weekends spent making decisions about tile and window casings. The house that had felt like a project they were doing together because everything in those years had felt like a project they were doing together. A 3-flat converted to a single family, 4 bedrooms, a kitchen that had been the subject of more arguments about cabinet hardware than he could count. It was a beautiful house. He had never fully stopped being aware of that. Yet he parked in the garage and went inside through the back door. Diana was in the kitchen, standing at the island with a glass of wine and her phone face down on the counter in front of her, which was the tel he had catalogued 2 months ago. A year ago, she would have had her phone face up. She looked up when he came in. Her face did the thing it always did. A brief assessment, rapid and practiced, reading him before deciding what register to use. "Long day," she said. Not a question. "Routine," he said. He went to the refrigerator and took out a bottle of water. "You eat?" "I was waiting on you." "I'm not hungry." He unscrewed the bottle cap. "I have to go back to the office for a few hours. There's a deal we're looking at in the suburbs, numbers I need to run." She nodded. She was watching him. He could feel her watching him. He had always been able to feel it, the quality of her attention, the way it had a temperature. 6 years ago, that temperature had been warm. Now it was measuring. He wondered how long it had been measuring and how long he had failed to notice because he had not been looking for it. He drank the water, set the bottle on the counter. "I might be late," he said. He picked up his keys from the bowl by the back door. "Don't wait up." He went back out through the garage. He did not go to the office. He drove to a quiet bar in the West Loop that he knew had booths with high backs and bad lighting and where no one he knew was likely to be on a Thursday evening. He ordered a whiskey neat and sat in the back booth and thought for 2 hours. Not about the strategy. He already knew the strategy. So he thought about the architecture of the next 35 days, the precise behavioral performance he needed to sustain, the level of emotional compartmentalization required to be present in his own home, to sit across a dining table from Diana, to say ordinary things in ordinary ways, while the machinery of what was actually happening ground forward at its own pace. He had done difficult things before. He had worked through a period of clinical depression in his late 20s that he had not disclosed to anyone, had kept operating, kept making deals, kept showing up, through a darkness that had been so habitual it had eventually ceased to register as remarkable. He had managed a near collapse of the fund in year 3, and when 2 large investors pulled out in the same month and the remaining capital was insufficient to service the operating loans on 3 properties simultaneously, and he had restructured that crisis over 1 weekend, alone, without sleep, and had not told Marcus the full gravity of the situation until it was resolved. He knew how to perform normalcy under pressure. He had been doing it for a long time. The whiskey was good. He drank it slowly. On Friday morning, he met Ray Fontaine in Ray's office, a deliberately unremarkable space that Ray had chosen specifically because impressive offices made some clients nervous, and nervous clients made mistakes. Ray was tall, thin, unhurried, with the quality of a man who had never in his adult life been caught off guard. He wore the same style of dark suit regardless of the season. And he read the operating agreement, all 3 amendments, without speaking, occasionally making small marks in pencil on a separate sheet of paper. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Ethan. "The formula is challengeable," he said. "Not on its face. The formula is what both parties agreed to. It's in black and white. But on the grounds of unconscionability in the specific factual context of a partner who has engaged in undisclosed fiduciary breaches that have materially affected the agreement's balance of value." He paused. "In plain language, if Marcus has been meeting with your institutional investors in bad faith while still a fiduciary of the firm, those meetings constitute a breach of his duty of loyalty. As that breach undermines his right to enforce the buyout provision on its standard terms." "Can you prove the meetings were in bad faith without triggering the operating agreement's notification clause?" "Proving the meetings happened is different from proving their content. Your investigator can document that meetings occurred. The inference of bad faith is then established through the pattern, the secrecy, the timing, the fact that he excluded you. A court would not need testimony about what was said to draw reasonable inferences." Ray picked up his pencil. "Here is what I would need from you to build the challenge. First, the full investigator's report, all of it, not just the business component, because if there is an affair, it creates an additional basis for a conflict of interest argument. Second, and any communications from Marcus over the past 6 months that can be preserved and produced, emails, texts, anything documented. Third, the full financial records of the firm for the past year, specifically any unusual fund flows, unusual expenses, anything that might suggest Marcus was incurring firm costs in support of the investor meetings." "I can get you the financial records today," Ethan said. "Do it tonight." "And Ethan." Ray looked at him directly. "If he triggers the buyout provision before we have the evidence package assembled and the challenge filed, we are in a reactive position. The goal is to have everything ready before he moves, so that the moment he files the notice, we can immediately counter with the fiduciary breach claim and seek a temporary injunction against the buyout pending resolution of the breach." "That's exactly what I want. Then we need the evidence package complete in 2 weeks." Ray wrote a number on a separate piece of paper and slid it across. "This is my retainer for the matter." Ethan looked at the number. It was high. He did not negotiate. He spent that evening in his home office, with the door closed, pulling financial records from the firm's accounting system. He had full system access as the majority partner and managing member, and Marcus's ability to restrict that access was limited without triggering the very notification provisions he presumably wanted to avoid. He reviewed 12 months of operating expenses, fee income, fund distributions, and expense reimbursements. But what he found took an hour to fully understand. Marcus had been billing the firm for travel expenses, flights, hotels, client entertainment, at a rate of approximately $4,000 per month over the past 6 months. The expense reports were properly submitted, properly categorized, and had been approved through the firm's standard approval process, which routed expenses under $10,000 to the operations manager rather than to Ethan directly. Nothing about them, taken individually, would have flagged. But Ethan knew the firm's client list. He knew the cities where their actual clients were located. He pulled the travel itineraries in the expense reports and cross-referenced them with Marcus's firm calendar, which he had access to through their shared internal system. New York, 3 times. Dallas, once. Boston, once. As their firm had no active clients in Boston, the expenses for the Boston trip were categorized as new business development, prospective client, confidential. He photographed the screen with his phone. Then he exported the records and saved them to a flash drive he had bought from a CVS that afternoon. A brand new drive in an unopened package that he had paid for with cash. He placed the flash drive in the inside pocket of his jacket. Diana knocked on the office door at 11:15. "Coming to bed," she said through the door. "Another hour," he said. A pause. "Okay," she said. He listened to her footsteps move down the hall. He turned back to the screen and continued pulling records. The next 3 weeks were the quietest 3 weeks of his life. Not quiet in the peaceful sense, quiet in the sense that a machine is quiet when it is running correctly, with no wasted movement, no extra noise. He went to work each day at his normal time. He had lunch with Marcus twice, both at Marcus's suggestion, the conversation ordinary and operational, deals and cap rates, and an upcoming investor quarterly report that needed preparation. Marcus was good. There was nothing in his manner, no guilt, no overcalculation, no telltale excess of warmth that a person not looking for it would have noticed. But Ethan was looking for it, and he saw once. In the middle of the second lunch, a very brief evaluation in Marcus's eyes, a glance that lasted less than 2 seconds, and then resolved back into the performance of collegiality. Marcus was wondering if Ethan knew. Ethan smiled at something Marcus said about a property in Wicker Park, and poured more water into his glass, and did not let anything cross his face. Irene Sato's appraiser completed the property valuations on schedule. The 8 personal properties came in at a combined $24.2 million, which was consistent with Ethan's informal estimate. Sato's paralegal coordinated the documentation with a Delaware trustee firm of Sato's recommendation, a firm that had administered similar trusts and had a clean professional record. The trust documents were drafted, reviewed, and amended over 3 rounds of revision. Ethan read every word of every revision, asked questions, pushed back twice on language he found imprecise. On day 29, the documents were ready for signature. He signed them in Sato's office on a Wednesday afternoon. The transfer documents were filed with the appropriate Illinois and Delaware authorities. The public record reflected a legitimate, documented estate planning transaction, supported by independent appraisals, executed by a licensed trustee, with a full paper trail. $24.2 million now sat in a domestic asset protection trust. He called Ray Fontaine from the car. "The evidence package is complete on my end," Ethan said. "Investigators' report, financial records, expense analysis, 2 additional items I found this week that you'll want." "What items?" "Marcus had a meeting last week with a corporate attorney at a firm I don't recognize. I found the billing in his expense reimbursements. He submitted it as professional consultation. Must business strategy. The attorney's name is Scott Paulson. I looked him up. He specializes in LLC buyout transactions." Ray was silent for 3 seconds. "He's retained a buyout attorney." "Yes." "He's moving faster than you expected." "Yes." "I need the evidence package by Friday. I'll have the fiduciary breach complaint and the injunction papers ready to file the instant he sends the buyout notice." "I'll have it to you by Thursday." He ended the call. Sat in the parking structure adjacent to Sato's building for a moment, the concrete cool and gray around him, fluorescent lights flickering at the far end of the row. He felt something shift in the balance of the situation, the way a room changes when a window is opened. The same room, different air pressure. Everything was in position now. The personal assets were protected, but the challenge mechanism was loaded and ready. There was nothing to do but wait for Marcus to fire the first shot. It took 4 more days. On a Monday morning, at 8:02 a.m., Ethan's personal email received a formal written notice pursuant to Section 9.4 of the Kohlveld Capital LLC operating agreement. Marcus Velde, as a member holding 30% of the outstanding membership interest, was exercising his contractual right to initiate a mandatory buyout of Ethan Cole's 70% membership interest. The notice cited the operating agreement's valuation formula, noted that the 30-day valuation period had begun upon delivery of the notice, and identified Scott Paulson as Marcus's legal representative. Ethan read it on his phone in the kitchen, standing in front of the coffee maker. Diana was upstairs. He could hear her moving around, the sound of a drawer opening and closing, the specific rhythm of her morning routine that he had listened to for 6 years. He forwarded the email to Ray Fontaine with a single line. "It's here." Ray's response came in 14 minutes. Filing in 2 hours. Ethan poured his coffee and drank it at the kitchen counter, listening to Diana's footsteps move across the ceiling above him. She came downstairs in a charcoal wrap dress, hair up, the particular version of polished that she maintained in a way that had once been for him and no longer was. She stopped at the kitchen entrance and looked at him. "You're home late," she said. "I mean, you're up early." A small correction. He catalogued it. "Have a meeting," he said. He put the mug in the sink. "I'll be late tonight." She nodded, and she moved to the coffee maker. He watched her pour coffee and stir in the exact amount of milk she always used. 2 precise pours, no measuring. And he thought that familiarity was among the stranger aspects of human experience, that you could know someone's coffee habits with such completeness and have no idea what they were planning to do to your life. He went upstairs, changed into a suit, came back down, and left the house without kissing her goodbye. She had stopped noticing that particular absence about a month ago. He had stopped about 2 weeks before that. Ray filed the fiduciary breach complaint and the motion for a temporary restraining order against the buyout proceeding at 10:15 that same morning. The filing named Marcus Velde as the defendant, accused him of breach of fiduciary duty, breach of the duty of loyalty, as misappropriation of firm resources for personal gain, and tortious interference with the plaintiff's business interests. The evidence package attached was 47 pages. Scott Paulson called Ray's office before noon. Ethan was at his desk when Ray called to tell him. "Paulson's rattled," Ray said. "The Boston trip was apparently not on his radar. He didn't know about that one." "Good. He's going to ask for a meeting. I'm going to decline the initial meeting and let the restraining order motion sit on his desk for a few days. Let the weight of it register." "How long before we get a hearing?" 2 weeks, typically. But the TRO motion will slow Marcus down in the interim. He can't finalize the buyout while the injunction is pending, not without significant legal risk. Ray paused. "So I want to be direct with you about something." "Go ahead." "The strength of this case is very good. The fiduciary breach claim is solid, the expense evidence is documented, the inference of investor poaching is supported by the pattern. But what makes it very strong is the personal affair between Marcus and your wife, because it establishes a non-business motive for his attempt to push you out. It's not just financial opportunism, it's personal relationship conflict creating a conflict of interest. That element transforms this from a partnership dispute into something a judge will find considerably more disquieting. Ethan was quiet. "I know you haven't disclosed that to me formally," Ray said carefully. "And I'm not asking you to disclose it today if you're not ready. But when the time is right, that component needs to be in the record." "Understood," Ethan said. He hung up. He thought about when the time was right for about 45 seconds. And then he emailed the investigators' full report, all 12 pages and 43 photographs, to Ray's office, marked confidential. Attention Ray Fontaine only. That evening, Ethan came home to the Lincoln Park house at 7:50. Diana was in the living room, her laptop open, a glass of wine on the side table. She looked up when he came in. "Long day," she said. He set his bag down. He looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, in the way he had not allowed himself to do for weeks, because looking at her properly required suspending the analytical frame and engaging the part of himself that had loved her, genuinely loved her, and which was still there in the way that things built over years are still there even when they are no longer in use. She was beautiful, and she was calculating, and she had made a decision about his life without his participation, and he had made a decision about her decision. And now the machinery was in motion, and it would proceed to its conclusion regardless of what either of them felt about it. "I know," he said. She looked at him more carefully. "Know what?" she said. "About Marcus." The glass of wine stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it back on the side table without drinking from it. Her face ran through 3 changes in less than 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, a very brief flash of something that might have been relief, quickly suppressed. "Ethan, I'm not going to have a conversation about it tonight," he said. "I have a meeting in the morning that requires me to be rested, and I'm not interested in performing the emotional scene that follows this. But I wanted you to know that I know, and that I've known for some time, and that I acted accordingly." She stood up. "What does that mean, acted accordingly?" He picked up his bag from where he had set it down. "You'll understand it better when your attorney calls you." "My attorney—" She stopped. Her expression went from confusion to something else, something more alert and less comfortable. "What have you done?" He looked at her. "I built everything we have, and I built it in a way that means it doesn't disappear the way you apparently expected it to." He said it without particular heat, the same tone he used to explain a financial structure to a new client. "You'll want to get a very good attorney. I would suggest you do that soon." He went upstairs. He heard her pick up her phone before he reached the top of the landing. He undressed, showered, got into bed in the guest room at the end of the hall, the room he had been sleeping in for 2 weeks without explicit acknowledgement. He lay in the dark and listened to the sound of the house. The radiator, which functioned identically in every room, the ticking persistence of it, and thought about what came next. The divorce filing arrived 3 days later. Her attorney was a woman named Patricia Cho, one of the better family law attorneys in Chicago, which told Ethan that Diana had done her homework and that Marcus, or someone advising them, had helped her select representation. The filing was clean and professional, citing irreconcilable differences, and requesting equitable division of marital assets, spousal support commensurate with the established standard of living, and attorney's fees. The asset schedule attached to the filing listed Colveld Capital and Ethan's 70% membership interest, valued at the operating agreement's formula price, $16.8 million. It listed their joint bank accounts, their joint investment accounts, the Lincoln Park house. It listed household contents, vehicles, and retirement accounts. It did not list the personal LLCs. Because the personal LLCs no longer existed as such, they had been transferred to the trust 22 days before the filing date. Diana's attorney, Patricia Cho, filed a forensic accounting request in the first week of the discovery process, which was expected. A forensic accountant named Kevin Driscoll was appointed, who was thorough and competent. He found the trust. He found it because the trust was public record, as Irena Sato had specifically designed it to be. Fully documented, fully transparent, with a complete paper trail establishing its estate planning rationale. He found it, and he reported it to Patricia Cho. And Patricia Cho spent 2 weeks trying to find a legal theory under which the trust assets could be pulled back into the marital estate. She found a thin theory involving the timing, arguing that the transfer was anticipatory of the divorce. Irena Sato's response, filed by the trust attorney's litigation specialist, was 40 pages of documented evidence establishing the business rationale for the restructuring. But the fact that no divorce had been filed or formally anticipated at the time of transfer, and the specific legal standards governing fraudulent conveyance in Illinois that the transfer demonstrably did not meet. The judge declined to invalidate the trust. The marital assets without the trust were divided equitably. Diana received the Lincoln Park house, half of the joint investment accounts, half of the retirement accounts, and spousal support for 3 years. She received no piece of the trust assets. She received no piece of the Cole-Veld capital equity, which was a separate proceeding, and which Marcus, facing the fiduciary breach litigation and the discovery process that came with it, had significant incentive to resolve before it went to full trial. Marcus settled. And he settled in the way that men settle when they understand that the alternative is a trial record that documents their betrayal of a business partner and likely business partner's wife in the same proceeding. The settlement did not use the formula valuation. After 2 months of negotiation, Ray Fontaine extracted a settlement in which Marcus Veld agreed to pay Ethan Cole $112 million for his 70% membership interest in Cole-Veld Capital, to be paid over 36 months with a letter of credit securing the obligation. The formula valuation would have been $16.8 million. $112 million was not a formula valuation. It was a negotiated number, arrived at in the presence of 2 litigators and the shadow of a fiduciary breach complaint that, if tried, would have been considerably more damaging to Marcus than the settlement price. Ethan's attorney sent him the executed settlement agreement on a Thursday afternoon. He read it in his temporary apartment, a 2-bedroom rental in River North, nothing remarkable, functional and close to a good coffee shop, sitting on the couch with a glass of whiskey and his shoes still on. He did not feel triumphant. He was aware that triumph was an available feeling in this moment and that he was not experiencing it, which seemed correct to him. He felt what he always felt when a complex deal closed. A kind of structured release, the sensation of a load that has been properly distributed finally resting in its permanent position. He signed the acknowledgement and sent it back. Then he put the documents down and sat for a while in the quiet of the apartment, the ambient city noise coming through the windows, the particular background frequency of Chicago at night, and he thought about the thing he had thought about very little over the past weeks, because thinking about it would have been imprecise, and imprecision was a luxury he had not been able to afford. He thought about Diana in the living room with her glass of wine, the moment before he told her he knew, the moment when her face had done its 3 changes in 2 seconds. He had replayed that sequence involuntarily, at odd moments, driving, in the early morning before full consciousness set in. Not with grief exactly. Grief implied wanting things to be different, and he did not want things to be different, and he wanted things to be exactly as they were. But with something that had no specific name, the particular quality of fully understanding something that you had partially not understood for a long time. She had come into the living room that evening expecting a man who did not know what she had done, did not know what was being built without his knowledge, did not know that the ground had been quietly moving under his feet for months. She had expected to manage him for another few weeks or months, while the machinery ran to completion. And he had come home knowing everything. That gap between what she expected and what was true was the entirety of the story. He drank the whiskey. He thought about the 6 years before any of this, the couple they had been in the Honda Civic eating gas station sandwiches. As the person Diana had been in that car, and whether she was still that person underneath the strategy, or whether that person had been a phase, a period of genuine simplicity that had been replaced over time by something more complicated and less honest. Or whether she had always been both, and he had only seen one of them. He decided it didn't matter. Not in the way it might have mattered if he had allowed it to, if he had spent the past months in grief rather than in motion. It mattered in the way a historical fact mattered. Interesting, worth understanding, not actionable. The weeks after the settlement proceeded in the administrative way that the ends of large, complicated situations proceed. Documents to sign, accounts to restructure, decisions about where to live and what to do next, and how to rebuild the working life that had been Kohlveld Capital into something that was now entirely his own. He started a new entity. He named it Kohl Capital Management. He spent 3 weeks building a new operating infrastructure, hired 2 people from the old firm who had never been Marcus's people, engaged a new fund administrator, and began the process of sourcing his first independent deal. Not reusing relationships from the Kohlveld Capital era, starting fresh, building a new client base that did not carry the complication of old loyalties. The first deal was a small commercial building in Pilsen. He had been driving past it for months, had noted its fundamentals the way he noted things, without acting immediately, storing the observation for the right moment, and he made an offer that closed without drama. The building was a good building in a good location at a good price. It felt, in its smallness, like something beginning again at the correct scale. He was working in his new office, a smaller space than the Kohlveld Capital Suite, on a lower floor with a different view. When the call came, 5 months after the divorce was finalized. He did not recognize the number. He answered anyway. "Ethan," Diana's voice. He was quiet for 2 seconds. "Diana, I know that you probably don't want to hear from me." Her voice had a quality he had not heard in it before, or not in years, something smaller than her usual register, some accommodation of a register she had not had to use for a long time. He waited. I don't know what I wanted. A pause. "Things haven't been... The business with Marcus. The investor meetings fell through after everything became public and the settlement payments are... He's restructuring, which means... Diana." His voice was even. "What are you calling me about?" A longer pause. "We built everything together," she said. "You and me. You didn't call when you were meeting Marcus in hotel lobbies," he said. The same evenness, nothing raised or dropped. "You didn't call when the buyout notice was drafted. You called now." Silence. "I know," she said quietly. "I know that." "I'm going to say this clearly," he said. "I'm not angry. I'm not hurt in the way people describe. I built the life that existed before, and I built the structure that exists now, and I'm in the process of building the next thing. And you were part of some of those things, and not part of others." He paused. "I wish you something reasonable. Not more than that." He heard her breathing. "The house sold," she said, finally. "I know. I assumed the equity from the house plus the settlement. That would be enough," he said. "Yes." Was it? A very long pause. "No," she said. "Patricia's fees were, and I didn't realize how much the monthly expenses were when the business income stopped, and—" He let her finish. When she was done, the silence was the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable so much as it is precise. "I can recommend a financial advisor," he said. "Someone who is very good at helping people build realistic budgets from available resources. I'll text you her name." He ended the call. He sat at the desk for a moment, Marsa looking at the view from the lower floor. A different angle on the same city, rooftops and water towers, and the middle distance of a skyline that went on and on. Then he opened the deal file for the Pilsen building and went back to work. That evening, he stopped at the coffee shop around the corner from the office. It was the kind of coffee shop that had been in the neighborhood since before the neighborhood had become the kind of neighborhood that had coffee shops like this. Small and slightly worn, good coffee, nothing decorative, the same 2 chairs at the window that had been there long enough to show use. He ordered a black coffee. The woman behind the counter was around his age, methodical in the way of people who are good at things they do every day. When she poured the coffee with the specific attention of someone who was not thinking about anything else while pouring it, she set it on the counter without a word. He paid. He took the cup to the window chair. Outside, the street moved in the late afternoon October light. The same light, the same October, another year turning the same way years turned. He drank the coffee. It was hot. He thought about the Pilsen building, the deal terms, the renovation scope he had sketched in his head on the most recent walkthrough. He thought about what the cap rate would look like after the improvements he had identified, the likely tenant profile, the hold period that made sense given the neighborhood's trajectory. He thought about none of the other things. His phone buzzed. At a text from Ray Fontaine. "Second settlement payment from Veld received and confirmed. 34 payments remaining." He read the text, put the phone face down on the table, looked out the window. The coffee was good. He finished it and set the cup down and picked up his phone and opened the deal file and read the third-party inspection report for the 4th time. Not because he needed to read it a 4th time, but because reading it carefully was the correct thing to do, and he was a man who did the correct thing carefully, and had been that man for a long time, and intended to remain that man indefinitely. Outside, the October afternoon did what October afternoons in Chicago always do, turned gray at the edges, let the light get low and angular, let the cold come in off the lake in the slow and implacable way it always came. Not asking permission, not announcing itself, simply arriving and remaining. He ordered a second coffee. The woman behind the counter poured it the same way she had poured the first one. Without excess, without theater, with the specific attention of someone doing something correctly. She set it on the counter. He paid. He sat back down at the window. He opened a new spreadsheet on his phone and began entering the numbers for the Pilsen building.
The 2 seasons. It's on Amazon Prime. And it's really good. Have you ever played the Fallout games?
Our forces are running low. Don't be easy targets.
If I haven't played them, but have mates that I watch that have. The Fallout games are so good. They're a little dated now. Like Fallout 3 and New Vegas is the best. Which is kind of funny because when New Vegas released, it was kind of like, apparently it was pretty much hated, but I didn't know that back then. I was in high school, and I played the shit out of New Vegas.